co-founder of Empire State Capital Partners. We're here organizing this event. If you may, please take your seats. We're going to get started shortly. I thank you all for coming out to Ukraine in such a tough time. There's opportunities where there's hardship. I'd like to pass the mic to our also co-founder, Chief Investment Officer and Partner, Rulio Marsano, who would like to say a few words.
Dobre utro. That's all my... Good morning, everybody. On behalf of I joined Alex and our co-founder, Yaroslav Udubenko. I'm welcoming you to the New Ukraine 2015 conference. We are fortunate to have distinguished guests, industry leaders, members of government, investors, local companies, international companies, all looking for the same thing, to see the opportunities that Ukraine has. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking a little bit about our firm and what our views are on Ukraine. Our firm was created about a year ago. It mirrors a lot of what's happening in the events in this country. Our firm was created by individuals that believe that Ukraine will change. Individuals that are looking to bet their life, their future in Ukraine. I'm very fortunate to be associated with those individuals. A little bit about what we view about Ukraine. I have a saying that the benefit of being 150 years old is that I've seen these things before. We've seen collapses in different countries around the world, in Argentina, in Mexico, in the Asian crisis, in different parts. Ukraine is not different in our view. There might be different elements, but it's not different. And we see a lot of opportunity in this country. I'm going to say things that you all know better than I do. It's a rich country with resources in its people, very competitive. Ukraine will succeed. That's what I honestly believe. Now, our firm has two simple jobs, basically to attract international investors, and we'll do that by presenting tangible opportunities or presenting a fund that is 100% dedicated to Ukraine. But the other component to it is the advising local companies how to present and introduce them to investors. Investors will come. I had a meeting, I was talking with a gentleman before we started. Everybody talks about next quarter. We tell investors, you should look at Ukraine in a 1, 2, 3 year horizon. This country is rich and it will succeed. We believe, as far as Ukraine, that all the elements are here for this Ukraine to do better. And they offer some great, compelling investments in fixed income, equity, special situations, in private equities. We are extremely bullish in Ukraine. The second thing that we have, I think, is more of a personal thing to Ukrainians overall and to all of us. I have a son and a daughter. There are no difference to any son and daughter in this country. The only difference is they have a better environment, a better system, better institutions to succeed. We believe that significant changes are taking place today to make Ukraine a better place. To make those changes where people have the same opportunities that people have around the world. Ukraine will compete and we believe it will succeed. Lastly, this event will not be possible without where is he? Alex Bart. He was there with the hard work, persistence, and dedication of Alex Bart, our co-founder, and all the members of Empire State Capital. I know they had sacrificed their personal life to put this together. And again, we are all, including myself, very fortunate to be associated with them. I welcome you to what we think will be a very exciting program. And let's get started. Thank you.
Thanks again. We're going to have a special treat via Skype. We wanted to have live, but this is good as well. very famous Bill Browder of Hermitage Capital will join us to say a few words. He obviously has some thoughts on the geopolitical situation and also investing in the region.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Alex, and thank you, Empire State, for giving me a few moments to speak to you today. For those of you who don't know me, my background goes back nearly 20 years in the former Soviet Union. I had a dream one day back when the Berlin Wall came down to find my fortune in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and I ended up going to Russia at the beginning of the Russian privatization program to set up an investment fund called Hermitage. I went out there and had a crazy ride. Started with almost nothing and ended up running the largest foreign investment fund in the country. Had a great success for a number of years, and then had a terrible disaster in which I went against Putin and his cronies by exposing corruption. And in response, I was expelled from Russia. My offices were raided. My lawyer, Sergey Magnitsky, was ultimately arrested for helping me expose their crimes. He was then tortured and killed in Russian prison 5.5 years ago. And so I've now gone from being a full-time fund manager to being a human rights activist and political campaigner against the evils of Putin and Russia. And so I have a few thoughts about Ukraine that I thought I would share with you today, which might be different than what you read in the newspapers, and might give you some thoughts and some perspective about how this situation with Russia is going to play itself out. My thoughts are the following: that having seen up close and personal and in great detail how Putin operates, what I've learned over the 14 years that Putin has been in power is that his main and first and primary objective for a number of years was to steal money. He wasn't acting in the national interest. He was acting to steal money. This first became apparent sort of 3 years into his presidency when he arrested Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos, and afterwards all the assets of Yukos were taken, and then subsequently Sibneft the assets of Sibneft were purchased for $13 billion, which didn't make any sense. Why would they expropriate one company and then pay another oligarch $13 billion for that company? And from that moment on, it became clear that Putin wasn't acting in the national interest, but he was doing deals with oligarchs. And the deals got bigger and bigger, and they happened in a number of different ways. They happened where he would extort money from oligarchs in some cases. In some other cases, he would get money from overpaying for big public projects like pipelines. And perhaps most extraordinarily was the Sochi Olympics, which cost $50 billion they spent $50 billion on the Olympics, and it probably only cost them 10 to 15 to actually run. And so basically what Putin has been was a kleptocrat, and his kleptocracy was all working fine until about 2012, when people started to complain about it. And the reason that people started to complain about it was two things. One, he could be a kleptocrat when the Russian people were getting better off. When oil prices were rising, when the standard of living was rising, people were better off, and they basically accepted that his kleptocracy in exchange for a better life for themselves. But as things stopped getting better off, and then at the moment when he did this seat switching with Dmitry Medvedev, things no longer were tolerable for many Russians, and they started to pour out into the streets. And many of you, all of you, will remember in 2012 the massive demonstrations that were taking place in Moscow. And at that point, Putin was really shocked. And Putin has one basic playbook in these situations, which is to go after the small group of people who organize these demonstrations. And as many of you will know, they then arrested the heads of each of the different political groups that were involved in all this stuff, Oleksiy, Navalny, Udaltsov, etc. And he thought that was, the situation was under control. And then, to his great dismay, and this is where it gets very relevant for everybody sitting in this room, a situation arose that was completely outside his own control and outside his ability to predict, which was Maidan in Kiev. That all of a sudden, a much smaller kleptocrat than himself, but a kleptocrat nonetheless, and the head of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who was doing exactly the same thing, had effectively created a situation where regular people started to pour out onto Maidan Square to protest what was going on in Ukraine. And it started out small, and it started to grow exponentially. More and more people started to pour out onto Maidan Square to protest the corruption and the lack of national interest in which the president of Ukraine was operating in. And as you all know, the situation continued to grow and grow and grow until there was really no choice but for Yanukovych to flee like a dirty rat from Ukraine to Russia so that he wouldn't be arrested and tried for his crimes. And I can't even begin to describe to you how terrifying this was for Putin, because this was not a situation many thousands of miles away in North Africa or the Middle East. This was a situation just down the road in a country which was just like Russia. And so for Putin, this created an existential threat, that he thought that unless he does something quickly, the Russian people would get inspiration from the Ukrainian people, and there would be people with pitchforks on Red Square asking for Putin to step down in the same way as Yanukovych did. And so what does Putin do? Putin does what many other world leaders have done over many years, which was he wanted to create an enormous distraction. And the distraction was to start a war. And so he combined with a propaganda campaign of unprecedented proportions. Putin started by invading Crimea, and the invasion of Crimea, which didn't cost very many lives at all, boosted his opinion ratings in Russia from 55 to 88%. And all of a sudden, there he was, no longer having to worry about being overthrown because he changed the story completely, changed the narrative, and it didn't matter whether you were previously opposed to Putin for his corruption. Nobody could be opposed to Putin in Russia if they were fighting this evil enemy that they created in the press, calling the Ukrainians Nazis and fascists. And so now, in a good world, he would have just, in a good world, I should say, for Putin, he would have just pressed a button and frozen the situation right then and there. With 88%, he could have been happy and moved on. But the problem was that in this propaganda campaign that he ran, he's convinced that the world, convinced, I should say, Russia, that the Ukrainians are Nazis and fascists and are ready to ethnically cleanse the Russian-speaking people of eastern Ukraine, and that forced him into eastern Ukraine. So the obvious question, as anyone sitting at an investment conference, is how is this all going to turn out? And I don't have an answer, and I wish I did. And I'm sure that the everybody sitting there wishes they had an answer. But the fact that you are sitting there means that you believe that there's some chance that it's going to turn out okay. And I believe that there is some chance it's going to turn out okay. I think that it's turned out, Putin would like to create an example out of Ukraine so the Russian people never have an opportunity to think that they can do a Maidan in Russia. But I don't think that he's gotten the kind of traction that he would have liked to have gotten, because the Ukrainians have, the Ukrainian army has defended itself with very little resources valiantly. And I think that there are several things that may really cause Putin to be not pushing further, or not pushing further successfully. The first is that as time goes on, he ends up by sending Russian soldiers in, which he's now more and more forced to admit that they are there. The ones that come back in coffins creates a very strong public reaction in Russia. And the second thing is that the EU sanctions that have been put in place, particularly against refinancing Russian companies, has had a devastating effect on the economy. And if the sanctions aren't lifted, and if oil prices stay where they are roughly, then the Russian reserves are going to run out after about a year and a half or 2 years. So when I first started my fund, I moved to Moscow in 1996. And I moved to Moscow in 1996 right before Yeltsin was running for re-election. And at the time, Yeltsin looked like he was going to lose the election. He was running against a communist. Times were tough, and everybody thought that the communists were going to win. And even though his approval ratings were very, very low, we decided to invest our money in the Russian stock market. And in the subsequent weeks and months after we invested, he was able to get traction, and he was able to overcome the communists. And over the first 18 months of my fund, we made 800%. Now, I'm not advising anybody to invest in Ukraine now or not to invest in Ukraine now. It's not really my place to do that, because I'm not knowledgeable enough about the situation to make an investment recommendation in Ukraine. But what I can say is that for those people who have some confidence in Ukraine, the situation right now is easily comparable to the situation prior to the presidential elections in 1996 in Russia, which is that if it turns out that Russia doesn't destroy Ukraine, and there's some decent chance that happens, that you will end up making a significant return. Thank you very much, and good luck, and I hope that the conference goes great.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to have you. Hello. Okay, I would like to now present the first panel, Sergey Lesiuk, who is our honored advisor at Empire State and former head of UBS in Ukraine.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased and honored to start the first panel, and I would like to invite participants to the podium. Kateryna Smagliy, please, who is looking at the political situation in Russia and Ukraine. Morgan Williams, who has been in Ukraine for, I don't know, maybe 20 years now, and he was looking after US-Ukraine relations through the ups and downs. Oleg Bakhmatyuk, who is head of probably the largest Ukrainian agricultural company right now, and Andriy Pavlenko, the representative of the legislative power of Ukraine, and last but not least, Oleksiy Pavlenko, who is looking after in the government after the most important sector in Ukraine. Please welcome our participants. Ну, по записке, я думаю. Давай.